What if I told you there was once a prison where no one ever tried to escape? Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't understand what escape even meant. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of forgotten history. Today's story will make you question everything you think you know about confinement, punishment, and the very nature of human consciousness. In 1897, deep in the mountains of rural Bavaria, construction began on what would become known as Anstalt Vergessen, literally translated as the Institute of Forgetting. But the locals had a different name for it. They called it the prison built without doors. Now, before you think this is some metaphorical prison of the mind, let me be clear. This was a real place, with real walls, real inmates, and a purpose so disturbing that the Bavarian government sealed all records for over a century. What I'm about to tell you comes from recently declassified documents that paint a picture of medical experimentation that makes the worst horror films look like children's fairy tales. The mastermind behind this facility was Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a neurologist who believed he had discovered the secret to creating the perfect prisoner, not through physical restraints, not through psychological conditioning, but through surgical intervention in the human brain itself. Zimmermann theorized that by severing specific neural pathways in the frontal cortex, he could eliminate what he called the escape instinct, the fundamental human drive toward freedom. The first patients arrived in the winter of 1898. They weren't criminals in any traditional sense. Most were simply people deemed undesirable by society. The mentally ill, political dissidents, Roma travelers, and anyone else the authorities wanted to disappear. What made this place unique wasn't who went in, but what they became once Zimmermann's procedures were complete. After the surgery, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. The inmates lost all concept of confinement. They couldn't understand walls as barriers. They didn't recognize locked doors as obstacles. In their altered minds, the prison simply became their entire universe, and the idea of anywhere else existing became literally incomprehensible. Imagine walking up to a prison cell and finding the door wide open, but the prisoner inside simply sitting there, making no attempt to leave. Not because they were afraid, not because they were broken, but because they genuinely couldn't process that outside was a real place. To them, the cell wasn't a limitation, it was reality itself. The facility operated on a skeleton crew because guards weren't necessary. The inmates moved freely within the compound, following daily routines that had been programmed into their altered minds. They ate when told to eat, slept when told to sleep, and performed whatever labor was assigned. To them, they weren't zombies, they retained their personalities, their memories, even their ability to form relationships with each other. They just couldn't comprehend freedom. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Dr. Zimmermann wasn't content with simply creating compliant prisoners. He began experimenting with different surgical techniques, trying to preserve or eliminate specific aspects of human consciousness. Some inmates retained their full intellectual capacity but lost all emotional response. Others became intensely emotional but couldn't form new memories. A few were left with only their most primitive survival instincts intact. The doctor's notes, written in his careful Germanic script, describe these people like laboratory specimens. Patient 47, a former schoolteacher, could still recite entire books from memory but would stare blankly when asked about her own name. Patient 62, once a passionate political activist, spent his days arranging and rearranging stones in perfect geometric patterns. Completely absorbed in this meaningless task. What makes this even more chilling is that Zimmermann kept detailed records of everything. He measured how different surgical approaches affected productivity, compliance, and what he called operational lifespan. Because despite their docility, many of the inmates began dying within 2 to 3 years of their procedures. Their brains, damaged and confused, simply started shutting down. By 1903, word of the facility had begun to leak beyond Bavaria. Medical journals started receiving anonymous reports about Zimmermann's work, and international pressure began mounting for an investigation. But when officials finally arrived at the facility in 1904, they found something that defied all explanation. The building was completely empty. Not abandoned, empty. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of evacuation, no bodies, no graves. The inmates, the staff, even Dr. Zimmermann himself, had simply vanished. The only things left behind were the medical records and a single note in Zimmermann's handwriting. They finally remembered how to leave. Local villagers reported seeing strange figures walking through the mountains in the weeks following the discovery. People who moved with an odd shuffling gait and seemed confused by the most basic aspects of the world around them. But these sightings stopped after about a month, and no trace of the missing inmates was ever found. The Bavarian government, faced with international embarrassment and legal liability, classified all documents related to the facility and officially declared that it had never existed. The building was demolished. The land was sold to private buyers, and for over a century, the story of Anstalt Vergessen remained buried in sealed archives. But here's what keeps me awake at night thinking about this story. In his final notes, Dr. Zimmermann wrote about something he called neural pathway regeneration. He believed that under extreme stress or trauma, the human brain could potentially rebuild the connections he had severed. He theorized that if his subjects ever experienced a sufficiently powerful emotional shock, they might suddenly remember not just how to escape, but that escape was possible in the first place. What if that's exactly what happened? What if something occurred in that facility, some event so traumatic that it shocked over 200 surgically altered minds back into awareness all at once? And what if, when they finally understood where they were and what had been done to them, they decided to take their revenge on the man who had stolen their humanity? The official records state that Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann died of natural causes in his home in Munich in 1922, but unofficial sources tell a different story. They say he was found in a locked room, surrounded by the medical instruments he had once used on his patients. The same instruments that had been reported missing from the abandoned facility 18 years earlier. Some stories are buried for good reason, some secrets are meant to stay hidden. But sometimes, the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, demanding to be heard. The location where Anstalt Vergessen once stood is now a small hiking trail in the Bavarian Alps. Tourists walk through there every day, completely unaware of what once happened in those mountains, but locals still avoid the area after dark. They say that on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can hear footsteps on the old stone paths. The slow, confused shuffle of people who are still learning how to walk toward freedom. Thanks for watching another deep dive into history's darkest corners. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started. Next week, we'll be exploring the mystery of the Vanishing Ward, a hospital wing where patients checked in, but the building itself seemed to forget they existed. Until then, keep questioning everything you think you know about the world around you. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones wearing doctor's coats.